Who's counting? I'm going to start by introducing you to what some of my friends call my basement museum. I have a room in my home, about 400 square feet. And from left to right, doorknobs, old porcelain and brass doorknobs and door hardware. The wicker basket is on the table here. That door hardware and locks in their original packaging are something that certain collectors look specifically for because much better. Some things, depending on who owns them, may be taken out of a package and put back and taken out and put back, like padlocks. Oftentimes you'll find they'll be removed from their cardboard packaging, used for a particular purpose, and depending on who the owner is, they may repackage them and store them. But there's a term in the industry called new old stock, meaning that it's aged, but it's never been put into service. And we'll talk a little bit more about that as we go on. But I wanted to give you a visual here that it's a combination of advertising pieces. This is a key rack from an auto parts distributor. This kind of an odd angle here. This is what's called a mortise lock set. It's designed to live inside the core of a door, not on the surface of it. There's two primary types of lock sets. Mortise, kind of like what you've seen here on the doors in this building. You'll see the door knob, but you won't really see much else. But things you may see in your home, depending on the age of it, is hardware installed on the face of the door. That's often done as a secondary measure, either if something happens in your life or in your neighborhood that you feel like you need extra security, or some homes start out with what we'll call skeleton keys as their lock control, and they're not particularly secure or difficult to duplicate. So you might add a second layer of protection as security became more sophisticated. You're going to see an image of this on a later slide. This is a showcase. We'll talk about how some folks display keys. This is essentially a walk-up key display here. The back of this gray case opens up and becomes a key storage locker with 1,000 different numbered hooks. It's from a commercial application in the 1950s. It came to me from a defunct boarding school in the Maryland, I want to say Baltimore area. I just bought this unit. Santa Claus brought it for me. This is a W.T. Grant display piece from the early 1960s. These are all blanks from the good old days when real people cut key blanks. Part of what I like about it is it actually came with documentation. Here on the table is the paper guide that helped you determine what key would work in your Studebaker or Opal or numerous brands we just don't see today. And that's honestly part of my passion for collecting has to do with history. Apropos of tonight's conversation. Not everything in this picture is that old, but it ages every day. And some of the more interesting pieces are in this cabinet because many of them are in their original cardboard packaging. Some of what's in the case here is foreign in its origin. The internet does great things depending on who you are and what you do with it. But it's put me in touch with traders and sellers in Belgium and England and other places I would not have the occasion ordinarily to travel. And if I do travel there, I probably spent all my money on a plane ticket and had no money left for keys. So, okay, let's not get too muddled here. Advertising pieces are a big thing. This glass globe says keys, and it would have rested on the top of a fixture probably 15 or 20 years older than this kind. And this is a very fragile paper shade. I was thrilled to find that still serviceable. And this is an old jeweler's case full of more stuff. All right. It started when I had hair. Really, the story began when I was about 7 years old. And many of you probably know the layout of upstate New York. I grew up in Canoga, south of Seneca Falls, and my grandparents had a home in Aurora. So we were about half an hour, 40 miles apart. And there was this one occasion when it was some morning, my grandparents were retired, and my parents' phone rang back when they were, rotary phone on the wall rang, and was my grandfather saying he was locked out of his chifforobe, which is a tall freestanding dressing closet. And actually the key to his chifforobe is still, I still have it. They found it under my pillow, and my parents had to drive half an hour each way to return his key so he could get dressed. Yeah. Well, because I was in this habit, even at 5, 6, 7 years old, of basically serving as the night watchman in my family's home. At the end of the evening, I'd go through the house, and they had some antique furniture, and I'd lock the desks and lock the dressers and things like that. But I didn't realize that one of the things to keep in mind with old furniture is not every key that locks it will unlock it again. It's always advisable, and we'll talk a little bit later about if you have a piece of furniture or a lock you're looking for a key for, tips and tricks to help you find that key. And one of the best advice I can offer is don't lock something to see if the key works to unlock it, like a door or something like that. Leave the door ajar, set the lock, or whatever the system would require. I learned the hard way. I think the pivotal activity was my parents actually paying to have a piece of furniture taken apart because they couldn't get it unlocked. Yeah, and I'm still around to talk about it. But that basically made it where, why don't you get your own? So 6 years old, riding around in the front seat of probably a 1968 Pontiac station wagon, I remember I can close my eyes and still see the glove box. The latch you used to open it had a keyhole in it, and I had a key on my side of the dashboard, and my mother had a key on her side of the dashboard. So I was driving cars when I was 6 or 7 years old. So that was really my first introduction to having my own key to something, which was a healthy distraction. And then it wasn't that long. This photo, I was probably 11, and I was on my way. Kids get different engagement with adults than adults do. When I go with my dad to get his oil changed and walk up to the service manager at the dealership and say, "Got any keys?" And there were obviously there were times people came to me with a lot of keys. And I don't literally have every single one I had, but I have a lot of them. Some of them are on the table here. And a decision I made about 10 years ago, maybe 12, I had finished graduate school and I needed a little money, and I sold some of my stuff, and I've regretted it ever since. So a rule I have today is I'll trade and I'll buy, but I won't sell. Because trading I do with real people, and there's a reason they want something, and there's a reason I want something that they have. And there's something about not exchanging money just makes it, I can't think of a better word, it makes it a more wholesome experience. It matters more. And what I'm enjoying today is there are at least 3 people I can count through the magic of the internet. Arizona and 2 other folks in Pennsylvania I trade with routinely. All it costs us is postage. And our tastes are different enough that we can satisfy each other's curiosity and build each other's collections, and A, not go broke, and B, it makes it easier and more comfortable, frankly, accepting gifts from some folks I've gotten them from tonight. Because you all know that when I go home tonight, I'm not going to list these on eBay. They're not going to get melted down. They're not going to be made into jewelry. They're going to be made into something that looks like that, or they're going to reside in something that looked like a museum. They're going to be treated with the respect that they were, perhaps that their makers never envisioned 20 or 50 or 100 years ago when they were first made. Because these, you may see a few over on this side that are what we think of as skeleton keys. And for the benefit of the group, it's a slang term. A skeleton key, it's really a misnomer. Some people think that skeleton keys run every lock they fit into, and that's not really true, and we're going to talk about design in a moment. But this is just a nice physical example of those early Victorian-style skeleton-inspired keys. To this day, a little harder to find, because think about the path of industry. There were handmade keys, like this one, a little rough, fairly simple, because not everybody carried a key, so they didn't have to be that complex. And the more available locks became through the Industrial Revolution and the reduced cost of production, then it became important that they be more complex and a little harder to copy and so on. So, This young kid is benefiting from the charity of others that say, I don't use these things. I knew friends of my parents that would come north from Florida every year with more things they'd found in their house and found from friends. And so this collection grew over time. And I want to next share an anatomy lesson. When we talk about keys, whether they are this style that for the purposes of tonight's conversation, we'll call these skeleton style keys, or the kind of keys you probably use to unlock your car or your house today, those are called tumbler or bit keys. These are simpler, but as I said a moment ago, they're earlier in their design, and they have basic principles that play out across pretty much every key you'll carry. They have a handle, the end you use to work the key, to operate it. It's called the bow, whether it's your modern car key or whether it's something from this era. The bow is what you hold on to. The barrel, maybe not as noticeable in a modern key, but it's the space between the bow and the part of the key that does the work. The shoulder recurs in 95% of keys, because what it does is it tells the key where to stop when you put it in the opening. Because some earlier doors, there's a key here called a Berlin key. I'm going to invite everybody after I'm finished to come up and browse, because some of what I talk about may make more sense when you actually see it. The premise here is these teeth, these bits, have to line up with things inside the lock. So they don't know where to stop, where to rest, if they're not told to do so by the shoulder. Not to get too technical, but it's important to understand that when you put a key in a lock, part of the reason, case by case, keys not intended to work a lock might work it anyway, is because it's not lining up with the shoulder correctly. If these teeth were intended to be where they were, and to use the graph paper as a guide, if you came over one box, if you didn't pay attention to the shoulder, you've got a totally different key, because the bits are in different order. They're in a different place. So, for the purposes of tonight's conversation, these are all ways that we differentiate one key from another. The shoulder and the bits and the length of the stem, all of those are variables that reduce the number of keys that will fit in a given lock. Because locks wouldn't be helpful if every key worked. Not to point to the obvious, like I said earlier about furniture in my childhood home, furniture especially has very few bits in most keys. So it's not unusual that maybe 6 keys would open almost all the furniture in your house. Depends on how exotic or expensive or how old the furniture might be. But we'll get into a little bit more after we talk about wards. This key is on the table. To think about, we talked a little bit ago about the shoulder and the bits. This is another dimension of security. And keep in mind, this is symmetric side to side. Both match, which is an easy way when you look at a key you've never seen before to tell if it's designed for a door that has a keyway on both sides. Those old, I think many of you have either visited a home or lived in one where the passage doors would often have a keyhole on both sides. The key that would run it, both sides would look the same because you have to be able to make it work from either direction. Whereas furniture keys don't normally live by that restriction because you're only approaching from the outside of the furniture. I know, you're all being very indulgent of this technical conversation. One more dimension. This is really all going in one direction, and that is to help you identify a key you might need for a problem you need to solve. Keyways. Okay, I want to go back. We called these case wards. These are end wards. Wards are shapes either on the key or on the lock that restrict the number of keys that'll work. So here, on these padlocks, there's shapes on the keyhole that further restrict the key that will work. So you have teeth or bits on the key, but then there's actually a profile of the key itself as it's coming toward the lock. If it's vertical and the lock keyway has a curve, the key won't go in it. It's just one more dimension, one more variable introduced in a fairly primitive environment here. Like this key goes in that hole. It's symmetric, so the key will work in either direction. But if the keyway, had more variability, if it was curved or if it was offset, suddenly that key wouldn't work in it. I know, I'm watching faces and seeing that this is a little abstract. And when we browse the table, I even brought a magnifying glass, hoping that would be additionally helpful. Okay, first cousins of those skeleton-style keys are called flat keys. As the name would imply, many of them are wafer thin, some have corrugations or cuts down their sides. National cash register sounds really secure. 90% of the cash registers made back in the day, that same key would open the case. It won't open the cash drawer, but it opens the area where you might service the ching part of the machine. But the principle being possession's 9/10 of security. You either have the key or you don't. If you have the key, it's easy and fast to use it. If you don't have the key, either you look suspicious trying to operate the lock, or it just takes too long. This is an interesting example. This is a Mosler key that was most likely used in some way in a banking environment, and this is a different company that makes similar bank and vault hardware. When you go to your bank today, if you use a safe deposit box, your key, I'll bet you $20, is a flat key. It's not that secure. But don't worry about it for two different reasons. One is, it operates what's called a dual custody lock. There's an example of it here. Most safe deposit boxes in a modern environment in the US take two keys. One belongs to you and one belongs to the bank. Little things they don't tell you. Their key is the same for every box. Yours is the variable. So it's not like they can go in after hours and get in your box. But the key, pardon the pun, the central point I'm making is the security is not about the key, it's about the culture. It's about how hard it is to get in the vault, and the fact the employees have been vetted, and you have to sign in every time you go in. So the culture of security is an interesting dimension to me around all locks and keys. Left to right, bank, steamer trunk. Anybody here watch like Downton Abbey? You know, when they used to travel with these monstrous steamer trunks. Hartman still makes luggage today, but they were famous for beautiful steamer trunks where you'd open this big thing and on the inside there'd be drawers and wooden hangers and all that. This most likely would have operated a padlock, and as I said on the previous slide, the teeth being the same on both sides, that doesn't mean the key would go through from both sides, but it's a convenience measure that no matter which direction you use the key, it works. Whereas on these, there's only one right way to insert it because the second side doesn't do the work. This big boy, that's a prison key. And much like we said about safe deposit box, doesn't have to be particularly sophisticated. Part of the reason they're oversized is they're hard to hide. If you're in prison and you have a key on your person, you better work there. Just saying. And they're changed out fairly often, so it's not like they would be counterfeited. And they're ordinarily marked in a very obvious way that would make counterfeiting them really obvious. Because that's part of the story too, is there are environments and there's some keys on this end of the table we'll see at the end of the presentation that have unusual bow shapes. That the handle we talked about, the bow, the shapes are unusual on purpose because it's a really easy way to detect counterfeit keys. That there are secure retail environments, there are secure government environments, there are secure proprietary corporate environments where we want to make sure that in the morning you come in and you sign out your keys, and when you go home, the correct keys came back and there's no extras around here anywhere. There's really expensive ways to do that today, some of which just includes waving your phone in front of something. But in environments like prison, keys like this, and there's several examples there, it's cultural. You either should have the key or you don't. And if you don't have the key, there's going to be a lot of trouble. And an asymmetric cut means it's not designed to work from inside the cell either. So kicking it under a cell door is not going to be particularly helpful. I do have a prison lock at home I meant to bring, but things were getting heavy. And I noticed on that, after I'd owned it and played with it for a while, it takes a different key on the second side. So presumably the guard working the ward, even if his keys were taken and put inside the cell, they would not operate the lock as a security measure. Okay, these are more like what you most likely have on your person today. This is a cutaway profile. Some of you may recognize Schlag as a fairly common manufacturer. Kwikset is another brand. You'll see Yale. This is a whole new frontier, pin tumblers, and there's an example of some pins and springs and things like that in this box. The way I like to explain the difference between bit keys, those big skeleton keys, and the things you carry today, is those bit or skeleton keys they're based on true or false questions, and these are based on multiple choice. The other keys, one of the biggest risks with old skeleton style keys, and the same with most flat keys. Some of you may remember early like master brand padlocks would have keys with teeth on both sides. And some of you, or maybe your fathers, one of the tricks with the old, let's see, I want to get to an example key. One of the tricks to make a key work in more locks would be to file down all the high spots and just leave the very end so it could sneak past all the restrictions that are inside the lock and still run the lever in the back. We certainly don't want that in the prison culture. But so with that said, that yes or no, suddenly we've just made all these answers yes. We filed off all these teeth and suddenly yes, 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 I want to run that lock. Whereas with pin tumblers, it's multiple choice. Instead of yes, no, yes, no, yes, no, the answer might be 7, 3, 5, 8, 4. A lot harder to trick the system because instead of yes, no, and the theory also doesn't work. You can't file this down and make it work them all because they have to, okay, not working, working. You want to maintain this, what they call a shear line, is what allows the cylinder to turn, and that is one of the history lessons associated with this is Linus Yale started his work. You'll probably recognize the name Yale Hardware, still on some equipment. He was one of the pioneers of tumbler locks because one of the biggest differences between skeleton style, bit style, and tumbler is with the earlier ones, the key did all the work. The key went in and the key made things move. What happens in a pin tumbler cylinder is the key, it allows the rotation of a cylinder that moves another part. So it's moved the work, which makes it more secure already. And it's also added this multiple choice question that's harder to answer correctly. But keep in mind, and this isn't to make all of you panic and go home and buy much more expensive door hardware. Mathematically, there's only so many permutations. I should go back to this for a second. That I said here, multiple choice questions. I don't know how many of you have ever taken a multiple choice test and had to guess on a few answers and you still managed to get them right. That there's certain security measures all of us can take that make these instantly more secure. One is, and I fail this test myself, I think. Maybe I don't today. Some keys will actually have the bit code in literal characters on the face of the key. Yeah, Schlag is one of the biggest offenders. It's nice quality hardware, don't get me wrong, but right here on the key, it might say 74635, and literally you can, with your eye, you can see the relationship. 7 is roughly twice what 3 is. It gave you the recipe for the tooth shape right on the face of the key. So what has happened case by case, especially in rougher environments, is a bad actor just records the number. Like a valet that took your car might check your registration in your glove box so he has your address, and then he has your keys. If he doesn't want to go to the hardware and quickly get them copied, he can at least take the serial number off your keys and reproduce them. So some better companies over time have encrypted that. It might be alphanumeric, it might be all alphabetical, so it doesn't translate as directly. But there's some brands that tell you the answer to the multiple choice test right on the face of the key. I know I've talked a little bit about keys and culture, but that's why I collect, is the way keys relate to our daily lives. These are some hotel examples, okay. Early hotel example. Asymmetric keys are not intended to be run from the inside of the hotel room and marked with the name of the hotel. These are highly collectible because they didn't really exist for that long. And when they went out of vogue, they were probably either melted down or something, but you'll often see these for some of the really famous landmark hotels in New York City, and some have really beautiful, almost like jewelry attached to them that were official to the hotel brand. Waldorf Astoria and folks like that. White Elephant on Nantucket Island, I just love the shore. Malta, I think I have some other international destinations on keys here. It's a reminder, and interestingly, a lot of foreign hotels have American brands of hardware. Most likely American developers commissioned the property, supplied the materials. And the one on the right, this is actually a Yale prison key. Again, not a complex design, but one that would be hard to replicate with materials available to you in the prison laundry. And that's oftentimes all that really matters in a circumstance like that, is do you have the time to replicate it? Do you have the tools to replicate it? Okay, another reason people may collect, because I hope you've seen on pretty much every slide, is a different interest area associated with collecting. Either the history, or the technology, or the style, or the rarity, because some people, I don't live that life, but some people only seem to like keys that cost $50 or more. I don't live in that world. A lot of what I find is either free, or I trade for it, or let's see, some of these. This is a Porsche Valet key, actually. The red handle alerts the user that it doesn't do everything in the car. And that's an interesting reminder of how even today we use some of the very early technology. The same principles that decided which skeleton key might fit in a hole and which ones don't are now used for many cars, valet keys. A little experiment you could try at home. If you have a car that has a valet key and a standard key, hold them up to one another. I'll bet their tooth pattern is the same. It's just one won't fit in every keyhole. Because in most environments, people don't have the time to do what it takes to go and get another copy made or whatever. So it keeps honest people honest, because at the end of the day, if they want to get in your car, there's windows. You know, really, part of the culture of security is that you either have to make it highly secure, like a prison, or you just have to live with the understanding that under most circumstances, you're going to be safe because you live in a safe place, and you surround yourself with honest, safe people. So this picture, this is to talk about the iconography of keys. This is French. This one's a Peugeot. Yeah, that's a Peugeot. It's a flip key. And this is also designed, the teeth are not on the edge, which makes it harder to duplicate. A fair number of you today may have, even General Motors, some of the domestics have gotten into high security keys. I think Subaru does it now. And this one's hard to see in this light. This is actually multi-dimensional. It's not only cut down the side, it's cut at various angles. Cadillac experimented at various points. These are from the 60s, before the steering column lock was introduced. These are from mid-80s to early 90s. And Range Rover, personal favorite. I'd never owned one. The most reliable part is the key at this point. But it's fun, you know. And the fact that they're all marked and they're all different, and especially this one, cross-collectability. A lot of you in the history and collecting universe will appreciate, some people want the key tag and don't care about the keys. I love, more than anything else, provenance, history, context. The fact that these lived together makes it infinitely more interesting to me. Some other fun examples I've encountered over 50 years of collecting. Carillon bells. There's almost nothing on earth of any value that's never had a special key made to secure it. This key and several like it at home they access, next time you're sitting at a red light, look at the post where all the cabling goes and down. It looks like a small, like an apartment-sized refrigerator on the side of that post. And 90% of them take the same key. Because it keeps honest people honest. If all you had to do was go up, turn the knob and open it, you'd get every looky-loo looking inside the box. But the culture of, oh, it's public works, nobody touches it. In some of the worst neighborhoods, admittedly, they swap it out for more secure hardware, but it is uncanny how many of them take the same key. Cessna airplanes, people that I know in that world tell me that this would probably open a third of passenger, small little puddle jumping airplanes. This is actually a folding key, most often seen in Victorian homes with pocket doors, because the reason it folds is so you don't shear it off when you put away the door. And because 9 times out of 10, you didn't lock the door to keep people out. On a security plane, you locked the door to keep people out because you were Victorian and you were afraid of being caught in your house dress or whatever. So it was a convenience and a social courtesy. It wasn't as though it was your outside door and you needed to keep the neighbors out. This one is one of my personal favorites because I had never seen such a thing. For those of you who've been listening to music since the 60s or 70s, doesn't that look like an RCA jack? Mm-hmm. Like a headphone jack? That's actually the key to a Pooch moped. Because it uses a lot of the same principles. It makes contact at multiple locations inside, and there's a certain resistor that all these years later, that's probably 30 years old. Nowadays, when you have a chip key in your car, it's the same principle, it's just more sophisticated. Next row, I know I talked about unusual bow shapes and the fact that they are often used for counterfeit detection. They can also be used as a convenience in like an industrial environment or an area where you may be changing keys out. Military is often this way, that you can tell if you're using the current one. You can tell by shape if, we retired that one last month, or that's the even month key. There's relatively affordable ways to manage security like that. So that's what these are. My friend Melody, who's with me tonight, gave me this one. On the table is a Yale 2 key. It's what's called a bicentric or a dual custody padlock. It's a padlock that takes 2 different keys that don't even move to the other keyway. That you couldn't reverse them and make it work, at least in most circumstances. There's a couple of different reasons those exist. Again, that's climbing in the Wayback Machine almost 100 years before modern computing technology and wireless. Those were used in padlocks and in door locks, and really any place you could use a lock, because it was where 2 worlds intersected. think of perhaps a college campus or a manufacturing campus where East Side may produce things and West Side ships things. Or the East Side is the girls' college and the West Side's the boys' campus. And there's people whose privileges are site-specific, and there's a certain level of administration that would have overarching privileges. Master keying is admittedly a thing, but we talked very early about how keyways matter. And what this does is that it allows guest keyways. Well, I don't normally do business on this side of campus, but I have the guest key that I can use to access that bicentric lock. I could spend an entire evening discussing why that matters, but mathematically, it doubles the number of keys that can be used in a large system without having unauthorized keys work in inappropriate locations. Because that's a primary consideration with what's called key control. That if you are in a high-rise hotel and you have 500 rooms and you're not using plastic cards to get in and out, you need some assurance that the people on 3rd floor can't go room shopping on the 7th floor and get in. And with some of these earlier hotel keys that are on the bit style, it wouldn't be that hard to get into a strange room. If you really wanted to, you'd cut some teeth off that key and you'd basically have a de facto master key. Again, we surrounded ourselves with honest people and for the most part never had an issue, except, let's not overlook this. One of the biggest reasons these went away is not because lock companies wanted to sell plastic card keys. What this is, and the same thing is true for some of those really cute license plates they used to give you to go on your keys, is this is a great way to tell you where that key will go, so if you find it and you don't want to pay for a night in a hotel, you still have a key. And some years ago, I worked in the hotel industry, and I can tell you that even in the 1980s, it cost more money to ship that key back than it did to replace it the old-fashioned way. Because many of them had that indicia, drop it in any mailbox, send it back to the hotel. It would cost $3 to get back a key, it cost 70 cents to make. So lots of different influences there. Okay, you've been very patient. We talked briefly about this bicentric key, that these two keys are different, and some of the designs, they can work independently, and some of them, depending on the buyer's needs, behave more like a bank safe deposit box. Both keys may be required in certain circumstances to undo that lock. Includes an additional degree of protection. Some of the more sensationalist applications during the Cold War were warhead detonation. Two lovely, dedicated soldiers with guns aimed at each other for 8-hour shifts. When you get the message, you have to put your key in, I have to put my key in. If either one doesn't do it, they were supposed to shoot the other. But they sat far enough apart. Seriously, I have family in the military that can attest to that. But also, these folks sat far enough apart, they couldn't get to the other's controls. I mean, very primitive, but it worked. It was like a skeleton key version of human behavior control. So we talked about the bicentric. This one is early spare tire lock on the back of a Model A or a Model T, because it had to get to just that right spot to do its job. And this one is one of my recent favorites. It's a padlock with an odometer to detect inappropriate behavior. That if you went in that bag, it's from the Postal Service. If you went in that pouch and you weren't supposed to, it's going to trip a digit. So, yeah, it's the next best thing to having somebody standing there watching it all the time. Exactly, and taking away dishonest people's pension. In my very first photograph, I told you I had a 1,000 key cabinet that I just bought in Southern Maryland. This is, to be clear, the contents were not in it. That would have just, that would have taken me home, mama. But what I've used it for, because after all this acquisition, sometimes it's just hard to find ways to display things. I bet most of you have that quandary, even in your own home. You have a lot of beautiful things, but how do you give as many of them as possible, their own moment in the sun. I'll confess, as recently as probably 10 years ago, all of this lived in a garden shed.
Wow.
I didn't have a practical way. And then a friend of mine started saying things like, I've got some glass front doors if you want a wall case. And then I was at Habitat for Humanity and bought the jeweler's case. And then I now have 5 different, this is the largest by far, but I have 5 different wall-mounted key cabinets, because in industrial locations, they really were quite popular. It was a way to control chaos in a secure environment. I've got from probably 75, 100, 225. This one holds 1,000. Again, keeping honest people honest, and there were various versions of really charming Palmer method key control, little 3-ring binders where you would say who signed the key out and so on. These stories, bear with me ladies and gentlemen, when I was right around the time I was carrying all those keys, we hear really terrible stories today about, kids go to school and they buy, illicit drugs and whatever. Well, I remember being in 2nd grade and my homeroom teacher was sneaking me keys on the side. And by the time I was in 5th grade, I was spending my lunch money on keys from other students in school. Really, I wasn't that hungry at noon, but you promised, whatever. And I became who's a key collector gonna become friends with? The custodian with the 10-inch diameter, almost like a holster, this thing. And I had the good fortune that I was probably a sophomore or a junior in high school. I was old enough to drive. And my friend Karen, who I had known probably for 8 years by then, had been promoted from just, floor sweeping custodian to, by the time this happened, she was district superintendent of building and grounds. She'd had a meteoric career path. And this is Seneca Falls, home of women's rights, and I couldn't be more proud of her career path. And she called me at my parents' home and said, Ethan, the building has been sold. This was a beautiful, 1920s, 3-story, classically handsome public school. She said, you've got till about 4:30 this afternoon. Here's where you'll find what I left for you. Oh. And these are all the original skeleton keys from when it was opened in the 1920s. And over here are several different iterations of different schools in the district that by the time she retired, they had done a complete rollout master key of the BEST system, which is a brand name, not necessarily a value statement. But part of what makes BEST really attractive in schools and industrial settings is, I'm gonna put down the mic for a moment and show you how quickly you can change which key this lock takes. They do it faster than this. I'm just being fussy because you're watching.
Of course.
All right, we're just going to retrench. Okay, the principle is that a key takes the guts of the lockout and allows you to put in another set of guts that takes a different key. Brilliant. About 100 years in service now. Part of the reason not everybody loves it is what I just experienced. They don't always work perfectly. Well, these actually come from, these are war era from Seneca Army Depot. A friend of mine is the son of a fellow who was a locksmith there, so I came into that set legitimately. And years later, I worked in retail, and that's a very popular location for what they call IC, or interchangeable core. And if anybody's really curious, this is a sales catalog. It'll show you almost every possible way, whether it's drawers or cabinet locks or things like this, or just obscure military applications, that if something happens and you realize the key's gone, you can change it that fast. Some organizations change it every 8 hours. That used to be a very popular military security measure, was just stay ahead of the risk. So some of these brands have migrated that way since then, but like I say, these probably 1920s with the original architectural reference tags. There's some, there's another, okay. These from that same family, the red paper tag, never intended to face the public. It's what the locksmiths have on them when they're installing the hardware to make sure they put it on the proper door. And at this ripe age in my life, I watch for that stuff. The stuff that's thrown away when a lock is installed is the stuff I've begun watching for, just because it's that much more rare. And I do love handwritten tags. I'm developing a nice relationship with an architectural salvage business in Maine that saves them for me now, because there's no substitute in my life for, it's almost like I met the person that had that key because they left me a little note. Okay, keys with a personal history. Like I said, growing up, starting my mother's car from the right-hand seat in the front. Of course, no seatbelt. But this is kind of an overview of different kinds of keys, and it's a good primer of pin tumbler and best, interestingly. I have some best keys from when my father worked at Sylvania in Seneca Falls. This was one of the first bit keys given to me, but you notice how simple this profile is compared to this one? Because this one relies entirely on the shape of the keyway to decide what key it will take, whereas this one, we talked about case words and side words and all that stuff. This one was built later by Yale for more likely, an institutional application just based on its bow shape and what I know about it. These were from my mother's childhood home on Long Island. Yeah, those three. These two from a later, I think it was my grandparents' home in Aurora. It's funny how, your mind remembers things. The patina on this is what I remember more than anything else, is a very early key. And this is a Wilson Bohannon. In the last 60 years, Wilson Bohannon has only made padlocks, mostly you'll find them, Rochester Gas and Electric likes Wilson Bohannon, a lot of industrial applications. But there was a period probably from the 1890s to 1920s or 30s, that Wilson Bohannon made very simple door hardware, and that was in my father's mother's effects. And he was born in 1921, and their family home they built in 1924. I have reason to believe that's actually a night latch key to my father's childhood home. Can't prove it, but based on how I first came into it, I have reason to believe that's true. Okay, other cool stuff. Keys that tell stories. Cross-collectible is the idea, much like in anything you may acquire. Some people like Flow Blue China, some people like any China, some people like Fiesta ware, or only buy Fiesta ware if it's the $1,400 kick plate. There's some people that are very specific. Some people go after best keys, because Best did a lot of customization. University of Massachusetts, I think it's Mass, maybe Maine. Esso Standard, Humble Oil Company, property of various government units. This is, I want to say, Moose Club. And this one, I'm sorry, it's not that evident. It's mayor, when it was Wagner as the mayor of New York City. It was not truly a key to the city, but it's a serviceable Yale key. It can actually be used, cut to application. But these special markings appeal to a very specific collecting population, or to people like me that just collect anything that's small and beautiful. Parallel collections. Some people only collect key tags, key rings, things like that. There's some examples here on the table. Where did I put it? You should know this. Where did I put it? Somewhere on this table, and I'm sure it's still here, is a key ring that the ring itself is stamped One of the good students here will find it and point it out to me. Here it is. That actually the side of the ring itself is stamped. 1880s, 1890s. Some of those, believe it or not, just the rings, go for $150 or $200. It has everything to do with what country they were made in, how rare they are, because they're so identifiable. It either says what it does or it doesn't. You know, whereas so many of these, if they're unmarked or they're handmade, it can be hard to judge provenance. I just love the look of some of these things. You know, some of us may remember when that was what a pager looked like, or that's what a phone looked like. Rambler dealerships. Rice hasn't sold Cadillacs in Geneva in about 40 years. I do love the old state license plates, and I think I'm into about 14 or 20 states now. Those have begun to attract collectors in a different way too. Okay. And something we all think about, I think, because you're here, because it's a historical society event, is how do you display the stuff you like? I think I pointed this out from 90 degrees off when we first started. This is a tabletop piece with a slight angle, and I invite all of you with anything small and interesting to look at to just literally bucket it, and because I'm not done boring you yet, I'm going to walk you through the boxes. Top left is just a collection of not very interesting padlocks. To its right is some bit keys. Some are single-sided, some are double. The next is some lock cylinders that are designed for surface mount mostly. Some are for mortise. I like them because at the end of the day, I really do collect keys, not so much locks. But the more I learn about locks, some of these, and I regret I didn't bring any, some of these are oversized in their diameter, and some of them are miniaturized. That I'd say probably since, maybe post-war, late 40s, early 50s, there's been more efforts towards standardization. But during the late Industrial Revolution, makers would use an unusual dimension to make sure you never went anywhere else. Mine are that size, so you're always gonna have to buy mine because it's the only size that's gonna fit. Here is the really shiny one, is a set of, it's passage hardware for, what would it be? A rail car with private cabins. It's low profile, it's diminutive because the environment is so constrained. And beside it is a surface door latch, a bunch of Russwin door keys, a bunch of, let's skip to the interesting stuff. These are padlocks with various collectible logos on them. Kodak Security, Rochester Gas and Electric, more Kodak. They're all Wilson Bohannon. These are porcelain doorknobs. There's some modern stuff in here. I'm not discriminatory when it comes to that. These are all safe deposit box keys in their original envelopes. Once in a while, either a bank branch will close or a bank will be acquired and they just sweep clean. Change out all the hardware. Because we talked about keys fall into unintended hands, like mine sometimes. And sometimes it's just easier to start fresh, or maybe you have a corporate relationship with a supplier that doesn't like the stuff you have. These best keys came from a system. It was an entire campus, so I'm swimming in those. Mortise deadbolt sets. Let's see, other interesting things. Early Wilson Bohannon door hardware, like I said, only available for about 30 years and almost 100 years out of circulation. Some original packaging for various things. Combination locks, not truly a passion, but the more I learn about them, I do respect them, and I like to have a balanced collection. These are padlocks with their original packaging from probably the 40s, maybe the 30s. This whole box is most of an entire bank branch of safe deposit box keys of about 6 different brands, and I'm sure that's why they cycled them out. Because just managing the inventory to repair 6 different kinds, it must have been a large bank, and the age range is nice. They go from very early, probably 1870, on up to probably 1950, and it was my good fortune, many of them come with their original architect's markings and so on. And this last set, I should have brought that too. It would have been a nice way to explain master keying. This is a small, easily identified set, and the paper handwritten tags tell the story of 10 sub-master keys within a community of one master key. Because it's not unusual, probably even on this campus we're on today, that one or two people may have a key that works everything. And then there may either be cleaners or maintenance people or whatever that have keys who work certain doors in certain places. So master keying and sub-mastering is a really nice way to make that 10-inch diameter key ring into a 2-inch diameter key ring. The only concern, don't lose it. Part of what I like to collect is keys with special markings like master, SM for submaster. But in the environment where they were first issued, when you find it on the ground, you know what it does. So, best practices now is not to mark them as such. You might use a more obscure alphanumeric code. Okay, I promised I was going to get to something that would be helpful for you. If at home you have a padlock or a desk drawer or an interior door that you'd like to have a key for and you don't know where to start, because looking at this table sometimes might just be intimidating about which one of these might be helpful for me. So, the first one, okay, I actually did put together a display all the way here on the corner so you'll remember where it is. And I don't think I can hold them up and make them visible. The one on this side is going to be a flat key, perhaps corrugated, but you would see that on the keyway. It's going to be the same on both sides, most likely, because the keyway goes all the way to both sides of the space in which it moves. Again, I'm not sure I have anything on the table that would demonstrate that. But this one, almost like a clock face, this one only has one hand that starts in the center or near it and goes to the edge. That will only have bits on one side. It's asymmetric. This is, well, both of them could be padlocks or furniture locks, but they're not going to be on anything large, anything heavy duty. And 9 times out of 10 is going to be rusty pot metal, because more exotic furniture is going to be over here. Okay, this one is going to look a lot more like, this one's going to be your Quickset and Schlag doorknob keys. It's going to be your door latch, like even in this building, this lock cylinders. This thing may dial out of the door. It wouldn't without the door open and access to the spine of the door. But this is multiple choice. So these are true and false, to go back to that language. And these two on the right, these are the classic skeleton style. The one key difference is whether the key will be hollow barrel, or solid barrel. And 99 times out of 100, a solid barrel is for a door, and a hollow barrel is for a piece of furniture. Because the post, that thing that's inside the hole, is intended to create what the key pivots on. I know I talked earlier about if the shoulder wasn't on the key might rest in the wrong place and have the wrong relationship with the lock. The same principle exists here, that when you put a key in this lock, it's guaranteed to rest in the proper location. That principle doesn't hold true on a door lock, because what's in that hole is the other side of the door. You can't rely as much on that on a door lock. So, all right, you're looking in the box of keys at the cashier in your favorite antique shop. So remember, it's either a two-sided key or a one-sided key, both flat, or it's going to be a corrugated key and have multiple choice, a pinned instead of a gated. And over here, either for a door or for a piece of furniture. And also, this is overly simplified. Be mindful of keyway, like we talked about, that a key has to be the right shape to get in that opening, and some of the more sophisticated locks have fussier keyways, and you'll see some of that here. I tried as best I could to provide as much variety on the table, and believe me, I welcome questions. And if you want to see anything closer, I brought a magnifying glass. And let's see. I invite you to assess your own collection, whether it be what you have in your hand when you drove here. Many, but not all of us, have a junk drawer in the kitchen. And in it is probably a padlock or a key. Part of what I enjoy about collecting too is I really enjoy the sidebar conversations with people about why did you hold on to those keys that don't do anything? Again, I don't know if I brought any good examples with me. Sometimes you'll see stamped, or the paper tags too. I have some that say like, cottage, or, that tell a story about what they were for or how they were used. And I've met people making presentations like this and just having coffee with friends that say, I have the key to my first dorm room in college, or I have the key to the first car I ever owned. I have the keys to all the homes my parents lived in, most of the cars they drove, most of the cars I've ever driven. But that gets harder now because these things are expensive now. It used to be easy, like, hey, I'll get another copy made and I'll keep one for me. And I don't know if I mentioned it all. This one, not only is it sentimental, it's handmade. Because when you think back to the Depression, you either didn't have the resources or you couldn't get to it or you had other things to spend money on. It's cut out of a flat piece of steel. And the steel was probably all square on one side, and that's why the handle is offset the way it is. I just love the artwork. Admittedly, these aren't very appealing to me as a collector, but it's also, it's not about the panache, but we did talk a little earlier about some designers, some automakers, some door hardware designers go to great length to make sure their keys are easily identified, so when you throw them on the dinner table, people are like, oh, you have Baldwin hardware in your home, or oh, you drive a whatever. Well, I'm here to tell you I have a rather unimpressive filing cabinet work, and LSDA is a brand locksmiths carry that you can't get copied at most hardware stores. It's not some of the highly restricted, expensive stuff, but it's an interim step because, as I said before, keyways matter. And these are hard keyways to get a hold of, and that's part of why I paid a little extra, is I wanted to make sure the honest people that work with me would never copy their keys to the office. And like I said about your junk drawer, I think most of us have some place in our lives that might look a little bit like that. And, I encourage you to look through it. As collectors, there may be some really pretty things there. Shadow boxes are always in good taste. Even just a couple of cup hooks in a key location to perhaps remember, if it is your childhood cottage or your parents' last place or whatever, or a key fob or a tag that reminds you of a nice day in a nice place. Somewhere down in here, I don't think it's in this picture, I actually have a key from the hotel that was at downtown. They just took it down. Midtown. One of the hotels at Midtown Plaza. Oh, not the Cadillac. I'm not going to ask you how you know the Cadillac Hotel. But one of the hotels at Midtown Tower that's now just a memory. That's one of the reasons I think that hotel tags are so dear, is I think they're really sentimental for a lot of people. It's either the hotel where your honeymoon was a million years ago, or these are to the Clifton Springs Sanitarium. There's other, as we browse, because I promise we're almost done, some of you may be interested in some of the keys that are here because there's at least a couple of local significance, and I'm trying to remember. Well, there's the Kodak stuff. The company that became IBM, I have some keys from them. Let's see, I have some foreign stuff. Oh, Cutler mail chute. Does anybody here know anybody? Cutler was a Rochester company. Those beautiful, I remember traveling with my father. I was fortunate I came into a set of keys that the maintenance people would use to access You know, when you mailed a letter on the 14th floor and it only got to 6, I have the key to the 6th floor. So, let's see. Okay, this is a close-up of a few. Oh, hi, Aunt Marty. She's resting now, but my mother's sister has a key to her house. And I love boat fobs, living in the Finger Lakes. And I guess that's it. But that's about it. I'm sure there's questions. And when those are over, I welcome, please come up and browse. And yes?
What about, and I hate them, but electronic keys for cars that are using now? Are they going to replace all of these other keys then?
I think they're an interim step, honestly. I haven't figured out exactly how, because I'm amazed the number of people that now come and go with a phone. That either on your house or there's some commercial applications for that. The reason I don't think we've figured that out for cars yet is the whole oil change thing or valet parking. Some smarty will figure out a way to offer like temporary privileges. I don't know if they've quit doing it. I think before the pandemic, there was a program where Amazon would deliver to the trunk of your car. And you could offer them single-use access through like OnStar and folks like that, that I wouldn't be surprised if face recognition is on the frontier. Well, they use it. Yeah, I think they use it. Scout's honor, not by personal experience, but I think they use it for what they call intoxilock. When you've had a DWI, that not only you breathalyze, you face recognize because you can't have a friend blowing in the box. But all of those, that's a great example of how fixing one problem can totally change the way we solve another problem. But ma'am, you had your hand up too.
A master key. What does it have or not have? How does it work? What does it bypass, the master key?
Great question. That's going to be two different answers, but it's worth talking about both. Let's see. I want to find a really good example here. Okay. If I wanted to, can I have this light down, please? Thank you. If I wanted to create a master key in a bit key environment, the old skeleton key style, I would cut as deeply as possible and maintain the most minimalist framework. Because what it is, these are all the no answers. Do you fit this door? No. Do you fit this door? No. No, no, no. Cut it all nice and deep. Yes, 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 yes. So suddenly, because what it is most of this key is really just getting in the way of making it work. Whereas with our multiple choice friends, what we do is, right now the way that this is configured is there's only one right answer. What is done in a master keying environment is essentially you add pins, because this one only has 2 pins per cylinder, and they have to line up in the right place to create that shear line. But if in your mind's eye, if there's a 3rd pin in each cylinder, you can create a 2nd shear line. So key like 13579 order works, and key 24242 works. The trick is, from an engineering standpoint, you want to make sure they're unique enough that one's not mistaken for another. But that in good systems, there might be as many as 9 positions in each of these cylinders. So part of the benefit is it reduces variability. 9 times 9 times 9 times 9 times 9, minus a few things that never happen. They're never the same number. It'd be way too easy to defeat a lock where the key was totally smooth. The other thing you don't see on the better quality, and it's interesting they chose to design it this way for illustration, you never see a really deep cut up near the shoulder of the key. Because what happens, that puts too much pressure on the key as you work it, and it's at risk of shearing off in the lock. like those lovely aluminum keys. I've I have some examples here in a really beautiful color, but the aluminum keys during the 60s and 70s probably, when metal, that we were at the Vietnam conflict war, meaning no disrespect, just aged vocabulary. But you have to make sure that the key is strong enough at base, but then you also don't want to defeat that strength by putting cuts. Because what you're doing is you're just making the key smaller without reducing the amount of effort to operate it. So, does that answer your question? Yeah. This is mathematic, and the other one is really just minimalizing the amount of key that goes in the opening. The same goes for width of the key. That part of the way you can defeat a lock with an unusual keyway is just to sneak in. That if the, let's see. On this one on the left, it may be a little hard to see. Maybe this is more obvious. It looks almost like a comma in reverse. That requires a curve in the end of the key. But if you had a key that was narrow enough, it wouldn't have to be curved, because it could just sneak in just as a function of its width.
Okay, in the movies, you see them going without a key and they take out a paper clip and they do something on the lock. What are they doing?
It's a lie.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah, they're pleasing the viewer.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah, as a kid who spent a lot of time in timeout, because it's just not that easy. Yeah.
Is your collection labeled, not so much from the kind of key, but where you acquired them from and the year you got them or something like that?
Oh my.
No.
Well, my friend Melody has inspired me to a degree in that direction. Most of it, no, but in the school of one solution or one discovery serving numerous benefits, Facebook has done that. I belong to several online groups of collectors, and of course we all love to show off our latest acquisitions. So what it's done is it's created at least a 10-year look back for significant acquisitions. And I try to place tag them, some of my favorite antique shops, things like that. But yeah, it would probably add 20% by weight and volume if everything had a tag. In true confessions, when you come up and browse, I did try to mark a great many of these pieces, but they don't live that way at home. I have a fair amount of drawers, hooks, as you saw. I try to keep families together, especially, I know we talked a little bit about finding just that right key. I have several different ways I catalog keys, because if I come home with a padlock without a key, rather than looking through all 26,000 pieces, it's helpful to know, is it a one-sided key, is it a two-sided key, and I go right to where I keep those.
What's your mode of learning about all of this? Books, internet, I wonder if they have certain websites you...
Great question. Yes. well, I've learned an awful lot from people. Mostly from collectors, interestingly enough, because I respect completely the fact that locksmiths are bonded. They are professionals whose job it is to make it harder for you to get into stuff. So they're not normally particularly forthcoming about how the inside of the box works. So it's been a combination of trial and error. When I was 7 and my parents would have company, and you could hear the little Warner Brothers sneaking sounds, like, I'd run out to the car with a handful of keys. And, well, one of the things I was saying earlier is that, the culture of security makes a lot of assumptions. Until cars with embedded chip keys came along, and those sidewinders and just all that stuff, it was not hard for me in the 70s and early 80s to go out in the driveway with a handful of keys and get into people's cars. There are artifacts that are for sale today because they're considered kind of archaic, aged out, that are called tryout sets. It wasn't unusual that long ago, 60s, 1970s, that you could buy, you'd have to be the right company. A locksmith or a car dealer could buy a loop with about 60 keys on it that are serially numbered 1 through 60. And when Mrs. Jones would call, locked out of her Buick, or Studebaker, you'd take your tryout keys and you'd literally just try them out. And almost without fail, the right one would be on the ring, and then what you would do is you'd copy that one and give the consumer the copy. It was easier than taking the door apart, and the world was different then. So, yeah.
How big is the collection of people that collect keys? I mean, this is the first that I've ever even thought of collecting.
That's a great question. I think we're hidden in plain sight, honestly. There's a lock museum in Connecticut that is beloved. I've been there once, and it's on my list to go back. That area was very popular, again, Industrial Revolution time. A lot of the brands we know today have been bought and sold and bought and sold, but a lot of them really were born in New England. And when many of them sold or closed, they would start donating to an organization, a 501c3 not-for-profit, and there's some gorgeous examples of salesmen's pieces and corporate gifts and just beautiful things. I've been enjoying really getting in touch with how this is a global hobby. Through social media, I'm connecting with people in the third world and also Australia, New Zealand, Europe. They have some amazing, not to disparage the effort and investment we make as a country, but there's some foreign examples here. And I tend to think in the last 100 years, a lot of European stuff is prettier than ours. It just is. And I think some of that comes from, in America, we like things new, we like to replace things all the time, we like to always, what's next? If you have a 700-year-old home, you may well be carrying the same key that people did 5 generations ago. Properties stay in families longer in certain cultures, whereas we trade in our cars every 4 to 7 years, That's something else I enjoy collecting is car keys because they age out so quickly. The manufacturers change them sometimes every 5th model year, and with the advent of technology, there's a set here that there's some representatives anyway that take you from Model A and Model T, where keys were basically wrenches. They weren't special. They were just complex enough to keep, somebody from running up to your car and taking it. And, there's interim steps where there might be a couple of teeth, and there's some there also that have embedded chips, just to try to help you understand the progression in 100 years. So.
Okay, we're gonna have to end. You can come up and talk to them later because people want to see the exhibits.
Yes, I will loiter